Part two of the kinetic type animation. So we have so far brought our last name up and we've made it drop down, rotate, and wiggle. So not a lot, not too hard so far. All we've done is adjusted the rotation of our entire layer. We added some skew to our text. We also changed the position, so turned some position keyframes on, and then we adjusted the skew again right through here, and just added that little bit of wiggle, almost like physics and gravity are taking over. So to finish this up, let's go ahead and we're going to do two things. Number one, we're going to make this layer shoot out the side over here, but we're also going to make it pop up out of a mask here. So we're actually going to start with that first. We've talked about masks once before, but we're going to go a little bit different route with this one. So I'm going to start by just drawing a square or rectangle over the top of my text. It doesn't matter how it's where it is or anything like that. It doesn't have to have the anchor point centered in the content or anything. It doesn't matter. So after we've got that, we're going to go ahead and make this an alpha inverted matte. So now when our type comes out, so under that text layer, and actually before we do that, I probably should have talked about that first, because it's not by default that it shows. So right now that blue square does show, or kind of hides that text before it comes out. Down here, we're going to toggle on our transfer controls pane. So in this bottom left corner, you'll see right here, I'm going to go ahead and click, and that's going to bring up my track matte. And so these track mattes essentially are just creating a mask. And so if I click on the alpha inverted matte, it means it's only going to show, this text is only going to show outside of that shape layer. So you can see once it's away from that shape layer, it shows. If I was to choose alpha matte, it would only show while it's inside of that shape layer. So you can see as it exits, it disappears from that. So we want to make sure this is alpha inverted. That way it shows only when it's outside of that matte. Now you can see that my rectangle's a little bit too long or too tall because it kind of cuts off right there. So what we actually want to do is as soon as our text exits away from that mask, we're actually going to trim this down, and let me zoom out a little bit here. We're going to trim down this layer to only show while it's hiding the text. And now after the text gets out, it disappears. Okay, so we don't need to show that rectangle anymore, and that's all we need to do with that. So now we have a matte. That looks really good, pops out, there's a little bit of wiggle. Cool. So let's go ahead and show that type layer again. I'm going to zoom back in so we can see some keyframes a little bit better. Hey, after we get that little wiggle, we're going to rest for about 20 seconds. And then under Animator 1, we're going to add a property, and we're going to add the position property. So we could do this with our entire layer, but here this gives us just a chance to work with just the text, which is what we want to do anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on keyframes for position. I'm going to move just a little bit down my timeline. That's about 3 frames. And then on my X value, I'm just going to move it backwards just a little bit. And then, a few more frames down my timeline. I'm going to move it the other direction, get it out of my screen. That looks really good. So now when I hit play, it goes back. But now we have to create some motion for this, okay? Or add that same physics property. We saw here that as it drops down, that little skew, that's great. So to show that there is lots of motion here, we're going to create another keyframe for skew. Go the few frames down our timeline, a little bit less, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit more so you can see this. I've gone about 2 frames, and I want to move that skew back just a little bit. And we could actually reverse this if we wanted to. It's either way. It's kind of a perception thing. So I'm going to lean back to about -15 here. That looks good. And then I'm going to move down my timeline to about right here. That's a few frames down. And then I'm going to set this to about 15. Okay, so now I'll zoom back out. Okay, And as that moves backwards, you can see that it kind of leans back and moves forward. So now this is just a matter of timing. So we're just going to adjust some keyframes so that it doesn't all happen too fast, so we can see everything that happens. I can adjust these a little bit. That's looking better. Let's see how it looks. There it goes. I'm going to adjust these one more time just to make sure that's looking better. Now, the last thing that we could do under Animator is add another property, and we're going to add some blur to this. So now, when it gets about right here, I'm going to turn on keyframes, go down my timeline just a little bit more, and I'm just going to increase this value, and you can see it kind of blurs there. That's looking really good. So now, last thing, it wiggles, and there's some blur to look like, give the illusion that there's lots of motion. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of that tutorial. This is the end of our kinetic type, so we can watch our name pop in and zoom out of our screen there. We've got a timeline that is way too long, so we can find where the end is. Looks like we made it about 3 seconds is all we're going to go. So at about 3 seconds, I'm going to go ahead and adjust my composition settings here, make it 3 seconds long instead, and now I can zoom all the way back and watch that as it becomes a little loop here. Looks awesome. All right. Make sure that you go ahead and file, export, add this to your render queue. Go ahead and hit render after you make sure that you know where this is going to be saved at. Once it's rendered, make sure you open that so that it converts. Make sure you save that and then turn that file in. Great job.